name is Calvin Reid. I'm going to be your host for this talk. Welcome to the Comet Cometh, a graphic adaptation of W.E.B. Du Bois's The Comet. We're going to discuss Dr. W.E.B. Du Bois, Black scholar, historian, activist, Pan-Africanist, and of course, an Afrofuturist. And his celebrated short story, The Comet, and its adaptation into a graphic novel by Tim Fielder, to be published by a major American publisher. We'll put him on the spot about when and all of that's going to be happening. But joining us in the discussion today, I want to talk a little bit about our panelists. I'll start with Tim, the guy in question, the artist. Tim is an illustrator, a cartoonist, and an animator. He's born in Tupelo, Mississippi, and raised in Clarksdale, Mississippi. He has a lifelong love of visual Afrofuturism, pulp entertainment, and action films. He is the creator of the very impressive graphic novel Infinitum, an Afrofuturist tale, published by HarperCollins Amistad imprint in 2021. The Glyph Award-winning comic Maddie's Rocket, more to come on that, and the graphic history of hip-hop, to be released in very shortly, I think in the new year.
Yes.
In addition, Dr. Julian Chambliss, I hope I said that correctly.
Yeah.
Excuse me?
The Chambliss is fine.
Chambliss. Dr. Chambliss is a professor of English and the Val Berryman Curator of History at the MSU Museum at Michigan State University. His research focuses on race, culture, and power in real and imagined spaces. His engagement with Afrofuturism sketches from comics to community activism informed by Black digital humanities and critical Afrofuturist frameworks. Also, Dr. Reynaldo Anderson. Dr. Anderson currently serves as a graduate director and associate professor of Africology and African American Studies at Temple University in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. Reynaldo is currently the executive director and co-founder of the Black Speculative Arts Movement, an international network of artists, intellectuals, creatives, and activists. As I said, my name is Calvin Reid. I'm a contributing editor at Publishers Weekly, and I'm a co-host on More to Come, PW's weekly podcast on graphic novel and comics publishing. All right, the Comet Cometh is also a part of a larger festival, Carnegie Hall's festival, Dancing on the Precipice, the Fall of the Weimar Republic. And I know that Tim's kind of been in the Carnegie Hall's Afrofuturist Festival in the past, but there's a number of events that are associated with this panel. So Tim, tell us more about the events.
Yeah, the festival that Carnegie Hall is putting on with the Dancing on the Precipice is really it's pulling a juxtaposition between the kind of between the liberal environment and the very much conservative environment that existed in Germany leading up to Nazi Germany. And they're bringing a correlation in how it relates to what's happening today in our community. And I'm proud to say, I was involved with Carnegie Hall last year, as you stated, with the Carnegie Hall Afrofuturism Festival. And Dr. Anderson, who was one of the curators, asked me to come in during the Afrofuturism Festival. And that went great, and it broke my career open. And now he lost his mind again, and he asked me again to do it. So this time, I am doing an adaptation of W.E.B. Du Bois's The Comet, which is interesting because my company, Dieselfunk Studios, as a official festival partner with it, it's like, that's just one thing. There's so many people all over the world who are doing things both in the city, in the country, and internationally that all are kind of putting in their thing. Of course, Carnegie Hall is known for their music, Bernstein and everybody, and that's incredible. but they really have broadened their spectrum with these festivals to be much more inclusive. And I think it has expanded the conversation of what culture is. As Dr. Anderson said so astutely about Afrofuturism, it's part of the high culture. And that's one of the reasons why I'm privileged to have these two gentlemen working with me today.
Okay, now, but there's some other events, right? An exhibition, there's the Children's Deal, there's talks, and maybe you can just touch on that very quickly.
So the Comet Cometh, and this is why I love Calvin Reid, because he keeps me on track. The Comet Cometh is 3 events. It is the Comet Cometh Exhibit, in which the pages that are being produced for the Comet will be progressively shown over the entire course of the show. So every time you come back to the show, there'll be new pages going on. I'm very proud of that. And that will be the one in-person event. Our other events are the Comet Cometh Talks, and of which this talk that we're doing now is the first. The first will be, of course, with the great Calvin Reid interviewing us 3 gentlemen. The second will be with myself and the great-grandson of Arthur McFarlane, of W.E.B. Du Bois, Arthur McFarlane II.
Great.
Interviewed, moderated by Julian Chambliss. The third will be a discussion between Yatasha Womack and Cherie Renee Thomas. As you know, Cherie is the one who really brought the Comet back into a kind of public awareness. And the final will be a conversation with Joel Christian Gill of Boston University, and we'll be talking about technically how the Comet was done. Now, the third tier is called the Comet Cometh Reads, which Ahmed Best, who is now known as Kelleran Beck, the Jedi from The Mandalorian, is going to be reading the Comet, and it will be superimposed with the images from the comic, as well as original music done by my beautiful brother, Boston Fielder, of the Urbalt Orchestra. And that's it. It'll be going on from January next week, this week, January, all the way to May.
Hey, it's Tim Fielder's world. We just get a chance to hang out in it. I love it. I love it. I assume you got it all. There's so much, it would be easy for you to leave something out. So look, Dr. Anderson, Dr. Chambliss, I want to jump to you guys. What's your role? I know you're going to be writing some material for the exhibition, for the book. Why don't we start with Dr. Anderson and then talk about how you're contributing to this?
What I've been able to do with this current festival with Carnegie Hall, as Tim mentioned earlier, I was able to organize several different of the local collectives of the Black speculative arts movement from around the world to participate. So we have artist collectives from Brazil, Colombia, Canada, Germany, the Netherlands, Cameroon, and Cote d'Ivoire, from West Africa, and London, England, to each put their own kind of spin on their critique from their own geographical position of what was going on with Black life in relation to the 1920s and the Weimar Republic. As during the Weimar Republic, that was considered in the 20th century one of the early cosmopolitan places where people of different backgrounds and orientations could all meet in the post-imperial Germany as a fledgling democracy where they could experiment around film, music, and visual arts and architecture. And that was when I reached out to Tim and talked to him. I said, you know, also during this period, this is where previously liberal Black thinkers like W.E.B. Du Bois and Anna Julia Cooper and others around that time began to reassess American democracy after World War I. So a few years prior to this appearance of Darkwater and his short story, The Comet, World War I was supposed to be the war to end all wars and so forth and so on. And Black Americans come back from that war And then you're running head on into Jim Crow realities and then the Spanish flu pandemic. And then the years of repression, whether it was the violence of what resulted in the Tulsa race riots and the other race, or I just say race massacres, because I remember reading somewhere people use the term riot so that the insurance companies wouldn't have to pay out any insurance. So they were race massacres. East St. Louis, it happened all across the country. And this is where I think Du Bois, as a much more mature intellectual, writes the Comet. And he basically looks at it from a perspective, and in the book, the other essay in there, The Souls of White Folk, where he talks about this pessimistic view of American democracy and race relations. And so that's when I contacted Tim and said, hey man, put this together. I think this is going to be an interesting twist to think about how Black people are beginning to have developed this international perspective over 100 years ago. And I think it was in conversation with our colleagues, I said, look, we've been producing Black people who had a very wide range of the world ever since the 19th century. And so, but it all comes together with people like Alain Locke, who's kind of an heir somewhat to Du Bois, who becomes the father of the Harlem Renaissance and what they would call the New Negro movement. And so I thought, and I approached Carnegie and said, you know, this would be an interesting take to take a look at this from an international perspective, to look at the fall of the Weimar Republic.
Awesome, awesome. Dr. Chambliss?
Well, thank you. One of the things that, in terms of talking with Tim, the history of the Black speculative practice, as Reynaldo so eloquently defined over the years, really stretches back to the 19th century. So for my work related to the project, I was really looking at those precursor stories, those stories by people like Martin Delaney, people like Sutton Griggs, Pauline Hopkins, and really thinking about the transition, as Reynaldo talks about, of the kind of speculative activism and what are the kind of imaginations that Black people are articulating throughout the 19th century, because they are, of course, studying the system and looking for ways to sort of achieve the sort of promise of the American dream, and increasingly are turning to more radical outside the box interventions and using speculative space as a roadmap to these are the ways and means that can be achieved to get that transformation. And in my mind, I think of Du Bois as sort of transition, as Reynaldo was talking about, as the end of a particular era of speculative practice by Black people that really sort of recognizes that the systemic nature of resistance, the anti-Blackness sort of born in a colonial system, has to be overcome by some sort of tremendous intervention that totally disrupts the sort of status quo, that the normal modes of life and practice have to be undermined by something catastrophic. And that, you know, can be associated with sort of like revolution. But in the story, he uses a sort of analogous of the comet as a way to sort of think about what did that disruption mean, what kinds of transformations and thinking are achieved in the aftermath of some total societal breakdown, which becomes a theme, I think, throughout the 20th century. As you see a generation of science fiction writers also think about the sort of decline of systems and the need for interventions. So as part of this project, really trying to make that argument and make that connection. And in the conversations that we'll be having later on during the festival, I'll be leading some conversations with scholars that'll be talking about the sort of legacy of these things, both from a kind of African perspective practice, Afrofuturism, but also talking to our colleagues who study German culture and the ways they engage with Black people as ciphers and symbols of revolution and resistance in the Weimar Republic.
Okay. So Tim, yes. So
I love being the comedic relief in this. This is great.
Well, well, you got the right people to talk about what you're doing.
Yes, exactly.
Well, you know, one thing I would like to do, I mean, just for whoever may be turning in, you know, obviously, you know, I gave my little truncated, you know, biography of W.E.B. Du Bois. Could either of you just very briefly sketch out his extraordinary career for anyone who's tuning in and might need a little more information?
Well, let me start with just the basics.
Sure.
Arguably the most respected Black intellectual, certainly African-American intellectual who's ever lived, Pan-Africanist. He also, and I'm gonna hand it off because I don't want to run with this too long because I'm gonna get my legs broken. The most impressive thing about him was he was a co-founder of the NAACP. This guy was multi-threaded. He was highly expansive, a deep thinker and a deep writer. And it's a privilege to be adapting this work. This would be the second adaptation of the W.E.B. Du Bois project into graphic novel form.
The second, what is the
In
other?
other words, adaptation was done by Rutgers, The Souls of Black Folk. Came out in 2023. It was the first official that I'm aware of.
Yeah.
And it's interesting. I would say this, something I was speaking with actually Julian about the other day, is that the Comet, what makes that story so incredible is that it arguably is the first, if not the first, one of the first post-apocalyptic science fiction stories. So this guy, who was already a race man, if you will, was expansive enough to create an entire genre of speculative fiction just by integrating the things that Dr. Anderson mentioned about collapsing of systems and, horror. And that's basically what the Comet is.
Well, that's one of the fascinating things about this discussion about the book you're doing. Like most people, and I'll say certainly like most Black people, my understanding of W.E.B. Du Bois is as a great historian. Reading The Souls of Black Folk, the whole notion of the color line, defining the 20th century. But it's only in recent years for myself that I started to understand his role in speculative fiction, and certainly as an Afrofuturist. Either of you want to maybe just talk a little bit more about that? Was this something that was understood at the time the story came out, or later on as we get a better understanding of how the thought of thinking about Black people in these different kind of modalities, or frankly in the future, at Black people having a future, actually became, a source for material, a resource for material.
I think, see what Du Bois represented, the Comet as a short story represents an excellent piece of what you might call Black speculative modernism, in terms of he emerges, I think he's maybe a little bit younger than, of course, he's younger than somebody like an H.G. Wells. And what they do with this Black literary speculative modernism, it juxtaposes what Europeans talk about, with H.G. Wells and a lot of writers in the late 19th century in London. Their writing emerges as a response to a crisis in British imperialism, whereas the Black speculative tradition emerges as a response to scientific racism, colonialism, Jim Crow, and imperialism, a whole different set of categories. And as something I'm writing for Tim now, it also lends itself to a kind of a pessimistic critique of white modernity, saying the only time that something can change is in the face of a catastrophe, as when we're able to see each other's true humanity when these structural things that maintain white supremacy have been smashed. And so the Comet is a literary and speculative illustration of the way we're treated as human beings only seems to change in the face of a greater catastrophe. And that's why there are parallels, as people more have talked about recently, how these pandemics or as somebody might call a black swan event, really shows you who America really is. Like what happened during COVID Same thing happened during the Spanish flu pandemic, where the systems that had been in place begin to unravel.
Mhm.
And it's during the unraveling where we each see each other as we are truly are that people begin to imagine alternatives. You know, so you could say the Harlem Renaissance and the New Negro movement can't happen if World War I and the Spanish flu pandemic hadn't happened. And so, I think, and that's why when we're looking at the Weimar Republic now and the rise of authoritarianism in the world now, and it's happening around the world, I always look at it as the silver lining that in the face of a catastrophe or some of these issues, we have an opportunity to reimagine alternatives. And what I like best about the Black speculative modernist tradition, and it speaks to what Toni Morrison says, it gives us that moment where white folks cannot live in our imagination rent-free. And so we begin to think about alternatives, and that's where I think his long-term contribution to what would later be called Afrofuturism lays.
Dr.
Yeah.
Chambliss, you want to add to that? Sure.
Sure. I think, you know, when we think about the Bois, I completely agree with Reynaldo. You know, as the first African-American get a PhD, someone who worked in academia, and I think it's important to sort of recognize that that work in academia was really sort of in opposition to that rising scientific racism that Reynaldo refers to, and the ways that a kind of systemic misinformation about Black people, about the trends associated with Black people coming out of slavery, coming out of Reconstruction, and working as a professor to do work, studying Black people and documenting their progress, creating some of the first visualizations, so showing the progress of Black people in the education field, and talking very deliberately about the ways that, from a kind of sociological perspective, there's really systemic failures on the part of white people and their practices that are sort of systemic in opposition to Black people. That's the real cause of why Black people aren't doing well. And that, over the course of his career, you know, he goes further and further and is more engaged over time trying to correct the record. And I think that gets very, very interesting that increasingly, you know, he works as in a kind of artistic field, even as the editor of the Crisis. Remember, he was the editor of the NWT magazine, The Crisis, and it recognizes the importance of art as a way to intervene in a way that this sort of information narrative isn't able to intervene, right? And we see this today. You can tell people the truth, but that don't mean they'll accept the truth, right? At some level, art becomes a space, as Reynaldo sort of indicates, that can't be policed by the sort of false narrative and the false imagination being articulated that's anti-Black. And in fact, you have to create a space where Black people can work through the possibilities associated with liberation. What would it take to get to that next step? And I think it's interesting to see a figure like Du Bois over time, thinking about his work, being very academic, working and thinking about, oh, are there legal ways that we can do this? Can we employ the courts and all these other things? But increasingly relying on the speculative as a way to really build the capacity of Black people to think outside the box and seek liberation. And I think that's part of the reason why I always think about this as a kind of key work that opens the door to the kind of speculative work that will happen in the post-war, right? Because after World War II, we get another period where Black people are going to press across all avenues to try to get freedom.
Now, does he have other speculative works?
It's a piece called The Dark Princess, which is actually where we have a colleague, John Jennings, has an imprint called Megascope.
Oh, Megascope, of course.
Right. Yeah, and that's where he introduced the idea of the Megascope in Dark Princess, where he's using it to sort of, really, that's a critique of capitalism. Again, if you think about the nature of his escalation is a horrible word, but you know, he gets more and more sort of very clear that the system is failing. And I think it also corresponds to a more diasporic approach. It's not to say he wasn't diasporic early in his career, but when you think about Pan-Africanism and the voices. Like he's really pulling together the strands of Black activism for really almost a century before, and bringing it to bear in this work as an academic and then as a kind of creative.
So let's talk about the plot of the Comet. Tim?
Yeah, I've had to swim in the Comet over the last year. So it basically takes place, it floats, it was written, it came out in 1920, but for myself, I tend to associate it in the early, the 1920s and 1930s, right? And it concerns this bank messenger, that job doesn't exist anymore, named Jim, who through a series of events is asked to do some work for his boss, who is a owner of a bank. And in the process, he goes down deep into a vault. And while all of this is going on, there are murmurs of the comet, a actual celestial event that is occurring. And the comet passes, and it ends up apparently killing everyone, except for Jim. And Jim is a Black man. And in the process of survival, he comes across another survivor who is a white woman named Julia. And in them coming together in that period, which is very much Jim Crow based, but also in the dense metropolis of Manhattan, they are forced to confront their issues on race, on gender, on societal roles. And because they are the only ones who are surviving, have to ultimately make a decision that they are the future of the human race. I won't go into anything deeper than that because I don't want to ruin the story, but it is very much in the vein of, I want to say, yeah, it's in the vein of The Walking Dead without the zombies, right? But it is very much, has all of the characteristics that you would see something in 1920, all those characteristics. And I consider, even though, yes, Du Bois was slightly younger than H.G. Wells, I consider them contemporaries. I consider them contemporaries. They were both pulling from the same technological and the same scientific strands. And that's why it's so prominent in that work. But of course, W.E.B. Du Bois was Black, so there was not as much attention paid to the project. So the Comet to me is a story about hope. It's a story about being able to overcome one's limitations in unison with someone else and overcoming those differences when it is apparent those differences no longer matter. And that's what the Comet is.
But isn't there a bit of literary cold water, or however you want to term it? It's a hopeful story up to a point, or am I wrong?
Man, you found the Comet hopeful? Some, it depends. Some people actually, because I've had to do so much.
Just asking.
No. There are elements of romance in it as well.
Sure.
It's very much a romantic story. So it has, it's like, what did they say? The Walking Dead really isn't about the zombies. It's about the humans and the horrible things they do to one another. So it's like that. So it, definitely has feelings of I Am Legend in it. All those type of things. It's the Comet fits perfectly within that lexicon of stories.
The horrible things that white supremacy does?
Yes, but it's also the horrible thing that men do to women, and women, specifically white women, do to men.
Yes, please.
One of the interesting things when I think about it, I reflect on the relationships in the film, and then when I look at it through some of my friends' lenses who might be, who would consider themselves Black feminists, how Julia is like all in on Jim until a white man shows up.
Well, that there.
and it goes
then
back
things
to
change.
and it goes back to white supremacy and white patriarchy can't exist without the support of white women. And so that's how I kind of frame Julia. She's just going on with who's the strongest person present, who might take care of her during the post-apocalyptic event. And so for me, that's the dynamic that I recall. And then I think about what would have been possibly on Jim's mind about his family that may or may not have survived the event. Like there's a Black family waiting on him after the event. So that's what I'm saying. That's something we don't know, in terms of him returning to his family, her going back to her, whatever her life is. And so hence that kind of hint of pessimism, or as some of my friends might use some a taint of Afro-pessimism in terms of these structural
another scholar, isn't it? Yes.
Yeah. These structural things are present, and the only time, and he said, and so that's how I see these things crossing several different ways, or lenses or axis of looking at how these characters play out these prescribed roles in response to this calamitous event.
Yeah, go on, please. Yeah, sorry.
As I teach a class of Afrofuturism here at Michigan State, and we read the Comet as a short story. It's a great thing for students to read. Can't make it read a novel. I mean, you can, but it's hard. One of the great things about the Comet is that I'm always asking the students, who do you think W. Du Bois wrote this for? And this is another one of the sort of pivotal
good questions
that, Du Bois as a figure, I think some of his earlier forebears in terms of speculative work, very, very deliberately, they're writing for Black people. Like they are not expecting white people to read their work. But Du Bois is, I think, always a figure, whether it was academic or creative, understood that there was a white audience that he was trying to transform. And so one of the things about the Comet is that when some of the characters' voices at pivotal moments are really asking questions that white people should be asking themselves. And so there's a way where you can sort of read the story, and it is hopeful because you have the white character sort of musing around and thinking about Blackness and thinking about the structures in society and the assumptions that she has as a white person. And those are the questions that Du Bois, and indeed all Black people, are asking white people to ask themselves, why are you this way? But then the question becomes, ultimately at the end of the story, I think, as Du Bois understood it, a system. And within that system, can you break out, right? And he's really using the story, I really feel, as a way to get a Black and a white reader, but really I think at some level, very much a white reader, because he knows white people are reading his work. He's getting a white reader to think about the things that they do, think about the system that they're in. And that's always the thing that's really provocative when you sort of think about this work as this sort of pivotal doorway in terms of how speculative writers of color are going to sort of continue down this path later on in 20th century, and have writers that are going to be asking similar questions, like a Octavia Butler, like a Samuel Delany, right? They are asking really important questions about what is it that you think the system is doing, and do you understand, especially from the perspective of a person of color, how the sort of precepts of the system are corrosive.
Do you think that some of his descriptions of the principal characters also indicate that?
Yes.
Who his readership is, how
Yes.
he describes Jim, how he describes Julian?
Yes. I think Du Bois is very much, even though, everything that Dr. Chambliss said, I agree with, but he is also, and this is going to maybe be an interesting point, he is also a consumer of that period entertainment. So he's using all of the tropes that you would have. How he describes Julian, these kind of almost lyrical phrasing, which
Rare
I have
beauty
to,
or something like that. Yeah.
right, which I have to, of course, interpret visually. That's the challenge of this book. Whereas Jim it's a little bit, it's that, which necessarily so, it is about that ruggedness, but it's about that ruggedness in conflict with Jim Crow. And so it's that dichotomy that when those two things are suddenly put together, it creates this very, very interesting dynamic, because it's not something that is, how would I say? It is not something that is forced on them in a typical way. It is something that is forced upon them by an act of God. Mm-hmm. If you will. That's what the comet represents. And I think the more I've delved into the story and done my breakdowns, and we could talk about, the book and all of that, I guess, in a minute, but Guy was a visionary to have done that story at that time. Mm-hmm. Who he was. It was just truly visionary, and it's, I would just say this. I have an interest in doing books that are forerunner books. Mm-hmm. I will eventually get around to doing other books, the Martin Delaney books and those type of things as well. Right. And because they need to be done. Awesome. They need to be brought to visual. That's why I think the Black speculative arts movement exists, is because it is giving visual to things that were restricted, in the best case scenario, by word or sound, or not allowed to announce itself at all. And the visual is the thing that's incredibly powerful. And that's why, I think Harry Belafonte did his own variant of the Comet as well, but it wasn't titled the Comet. But back in I think the late 50s and stuff. So it's an honor to be part of that legacy. As an Afrofuturist, it's part of the work that I did. It's a part of the work that all of us do. But for myself specifically, it's about doing work, hopefully, that will outlive me. And what better way to do that than to do works that were ignored and to bring them into the present, moving them into the future by bringing them into visual storytelling.
And using the great and dynamic medium of comics. And we're going to get to that. I am one more question very quickly. I'm curious, how was the comic, and including what the volume it was included in, Dark Water, how was it received at the time?
Come on, Julian, you got it.
Well, that's a good question. I'm ashamed to say that, like a lot of people, it is really Cherie Renee Thomas's work in Dark Matter that brought that work to my attention. Mm-hmm. And then I went back and looked, like, oh yeah, there are these Black writers who are writing. I think in broadly speaking, that collection was well received because it was in a book called Dark Water. As much of his work was well received at the time, I don't think that many people were focused on this particular story. Mm-hmm. I think this really follows a set of writings for Du Bois that were at the time very much these sort of philosophical explorations of race. As Reynaldo points out, they're a part of like a broader set of like ideological projects that he becomes increasingly involved in, and really definitional for a dialogue coming from Black people at the time. But ultimately, I will bow to the Godfather and say, well, what does Reynaldo think?
Okay.
Well, for me, what this book represents is during a transitionary stage. Du Bois writes Dark Water 1920, and this is just a few years before the Harlem Renaissance would take off, because during this time, the intellectual baton is getting ready to be passed from him to Alain Locke, who is within a few years after this book, few years later, writes his big book, The New Negro, where you have a new generation of people who have no memory of slavery, born after slavery, and come into maturity in the 20th century as adults. And
can I just jump in? Just for those who don't know, the great professor of philosophy, if I'm not mistaken, at Howard University, my alma mater. So that's all.
Okay.
Wow, he had to put that in there.
I had to get that in there. That's all right. So it's, yeah, go Bison. Anyway, yeah.
And so in Dark Water, to me, when I read it when I was younger, the chapter I was really looking at, I kind of brushed past the comment. I was reading his chapter, The Souls of White Folk. And to understand why Du Bois uses folk, you got to understand his ideological influences from German idealistic philosophy when he studied in Berlin. And this, I think, Dark Water represents the end of a certain type of thing that he gives up on, where the younger Du Bois is more in the liberal American tradition, liberal progressive, dabbles in socialism a little bit, and a seed of Pan-African. By the 20s, I think this is where he's kind of given up on his earlier stuff around the talented 10th, his move away from that kind of perspective. And it begins his transition into, I think, some of his more radical stuff, Dark Water, and then the other literary piece after that, Dark Princess. Because you got to remember, during Du Bois, when he comes of age, when he talks about how Black people in the islands and the sea and all are treated around the world, this is also where he's seeing the destruction of all these other ethnic groups around the world in terms of the colonization of Korea, the destruction of other indigenous populations from Tasmania to the end of Native American civilization and all these other things. One of the interesting things at the time, this is kind of why I like Du Bois, is he was considered arrogant because he wasn't trying to hide his intelligence or whatever. And H.G. Wells, who meets both of these gentlemen, writes in his own writing, H.G. Wells, I think, and I think it was in 1907, H.G. Wells said he thought that Booker T. Washington was the superior leader for Black people in America, as he mused, what would the descendants of the enslaved Africans and the descendants of the enslavers, how would they relate? And H.G. Wells was more of a fan of Booker T. Washington. And I suspect because, Booker T., who I regard more as a Machiavellian, and Du Bois probably thought some of these people, he probably didn't think too much of H.G. Wells beyond his limited perspective on socialism. Du Bois is like the godfather or the head of the thing, but it's Alain Locke. These are the transitionary years between 1920 over the next few years to where the intellectual leadership of the New Negro shifts to Alain Locke. And so that's what I think this book represents. It kind of lays out, look, here's this speculative short story of the Comet. These are the souls of white folk, and I got the gravitas to say that and get away with it. And I know these people. And so then in the aftermath of that, and of course at the time, it shouldn't be undervalued of the correspondence between Anna Julia Cooper and Du Bois, who are corresponding at this time about, the future of Black people in America. And Alain Locke and then pick up the baton at that time. And then a young Langston Hughes and other writers and thinkers are coming along up there in Harlem to debate some of these issues. And even some of them were flawed, but it was just the beginning. And then, of course, I always tell people a lot of times you can't talk about the ideas of Du Bois and the Comet without bringing up the literary nationalism of the Garvey movement during that time also. And so this is a time of a flowering of Black internationalism.
Did we lose him?
Hello?
Yes, go ahead.
You back?
Yeah,
We'll
I'm
cut
back.
that part out.
Okay.
We'll cut that part out.
Okay. Like glitch.
So it's a Black internationalist thing in the aftermath, because I know his book, The Dark Princess, was not well reviewed in terms of how it was received as a piece of literature. But I think Du Bois' work was much more polemical in terms of the politics that he aspired to at that time. And he really saw it was going to take a multiracial international alliance to overthrow white supremacy. And so that's why I think this time at Roy, I'm in reading him now. And in my conversations with Tim, I always tell people I think probably 3 or 4 of his most important works were, other than Souls of Black Folk, you got Dark Water and then Black Reconstruction.
Yeah. Oh,
Are probably the 3 most important things from 1904 or 5 up into the early 1930s, where he's at his best, along with, working on periodically, or he would later in life adopt the working on the Encyclopedia Africana, where it was the president of Ghana, Kwame Nkrumah, who is known to be the first person that uses the word Afrocentric in conversation with Bois, even though people like Molefi and Santi would use the word Afrocentricity, but is in conversation with Bois that Kwame Nkrumah is in a literary thing, is the earliest person to use the word Afrocentric. And so he has these 4 stages of life. That's why when you want to talk to Du Bois, you got to ask, which Du Bois are you talking about? The 30-something-year-old brilliant scholar, PhD, or the one who is a mature man in his 50s, begins to become maybe adopts a more mature aspect of what America really is, which I think he comes into full maturity by the 1920s in terms of what they're facing. And that's why he illustrates that through the comet and then the megascope that shows up in the later literature. And so, that's the best way, I think, in terms of when we're looking at Du Bois in that bracket, in that historical context.
excellent, excellent. Okay, we're gonna jump as time winds down. We're gonna jump quickly because okay, no pressure, Tim. No pressure. How do you turn this cultural artifact, this charged literary object, how do you turn it into a graphic novel? For instance, how do you get the rights?
Yeah, okay. So the Comet is, like many stories that were done in the 1920s and earlier, are all public domain. They're in the
Public domain.
So you really don't need permission. However, karmically, I know what it's like to do a project that you put time into that you don't get permission to do, right? So, and I'll leave that at that. But this one here, sometimes when you're doing something and it's closed off to you, another door opens. And so I'd done a project that was closed off to me, and all of a sudden I saw the comet. Now, I've been studying and looking at the comet for several years, and it was something I had looked into, and through a lot of research, talking with many of the different schools, different officials, lawyers, I found out that no one really knew what to do. And there were certain institutions that had a point of contact, but that point of contact was sort of nebulous. At the same time, I felt, go to the family.
It must be in the
I
state.
went on that magical thing called LinkedIn, and I reached out to Arthur McFarlane II. I did a Google search for him, and it turns out when I went to San Diego Comic-Con last year,
there you go, the mother of them all. Go on.
Given up hope of reaching, and he reached out to me, and it turns out Arthur lives in Hawaii, just the great-grand Arthur McFarlane II, and he was in California at the time. So we met online, could meet in person because I was in San Diego, and he gave me his blessing, which was something that moved me dearly. You know, as some projects you work on, they're very hard to get through. This one just felt like water. It just felt like water. It was so easy. And Arthur has been very supportive of my work. I consistently send him updates, which is gracious enough to agree to participate in the talks. So all that to say, nothing happens by itself. The Children's Arts Carnival, which is where my Black Metropolis show was held in 2022 during the Carnegie Hall Afrofuturism Festival, returns again to mount the Comet Cometh exhibit, put on by Jose Ortiz and Michael Unthank, and they are the administrators, and mounted and curated by Jose and Dionis Ortiz. The Children's Arts Carnival is a foundational institution in Harlem at the intersection of Hamilton Terrace and 144th Street around Convent Avenue. It's a seminal birthplace for many Black cartoonists. The Milestones group, a lot of those guys came out of there. Yes. So I taught
Wayne McDuffie and the group that you're referring to.
Exactly. The Children's Arts Carnival is like the Kevin Bacon of Black comics. It's always some kind of connection you could find, right? And so they, the carnival wanted to become more intentional about reaching out to the community. So when we met together and we decided to do the thing for Black Metropolis, the Comet was a natural fit. So the Children's Arts Carnival, along with Doodle AI, the process that I'm using, Herbalt Entertainment, Studio Visceral, the Afro Fantastic, the Black Speculative Arts Movement, the West Harlem Arts. I'm trying to list off all my.
Let me jump in here, though. What the designing the characters?
I'm gonna get to that. I'm gonna get to that.
Yeah, all right. Okay.
I'm gonna get to that. So all of these things mean that it does not happen by itself. Now, the work I have to do, that part that can't be done with other folks, you have to do it by yourself, right?
Right.
I am a very cinematic thinker. I'm a very cinematic person, and so for me, I see everything as a kind of a fusion of a film, animation, and comics together. And very often, to try to keep things fresh, I like to pull from different influences. So I would say stylistically, what the Comet is, as I'm putting together with design of the characters, take young Morgan Freeman. Right?
Okay.
Hey, it's young, and I tell folks this, hey man, he's like young Morgan Freeman. All the ladies who I said, ooh, right. So yeah, I'm doing all of the things because I'm sorry, I have to say this. The Comet is a piece of pop culture. It really is.
Oh, absolutely.
It really is. Of past pop culture. And I base the characters on real actors. A real, influence. They're not exact duplicates of them. Julia is, I forget, I can't believe I'm blanking out on her name. A famous European actress. I can't believe it, with the bob haircut. I'm sorry, I'm forgetting her name.
Louise Brooks.
Yes, Louise Brooks. Yes. So I'm basing her on Louise Brooks. So visually, it's Hugh Ferris was the architect who designed a lot of the Federalist buildings in New York City. You actually can see those design influences in Batman, the animated series. That's what they would influence. So when you see a lot of Art Deco work, you're looking at a lot of the design influence of people like Hugh Ferris, Frank Lloyd Wright. So I want to pull that into it. And also Francois Chouton, who is the band designated artist who does all of the architectural. That's what the Comet is. So
he does these fantasy urban landscapes.
Exactly. So this is a tremendous opportunity to fuse all these different things that I love, band designated, Art Deco, but bring it into this Black thing. This Black thing. That's what I want to do. And I want to do something that is powerful, that is emotive, but also as a digital artist, I use technology. I use game engines. I use 3D animation. I use digital illustration tools. I use a little bit of sprinkling of AI. All of it together can represent something that is both timely and timeless. So that's
the
what
setting. The setting is obviously Manhattan, but there seems to be also, as you put, almost a fantasy element as well. I mean, what is the Metropolitan Tower?
I thought it was the Met building. That's what I thought. But see, that's what I'm saying. It's like, for example, I've spoke with people who read the book. Some people say, well, the comet hits. But some people say, well, the comet just passes by. So the beauty of the way Du Bois wrote was there was a little ambiguity in it. So I can tell the story, with faith, but also take visual opportunities. For example, I see in my head, well, if a comet passes by, does it leave particles? So one of the motifs that is inherent in the book that I'm using is that it's black and white, but there are elements of green in it, like a comet, right? Because that harkens to kryptonite, Superman. The other thing, one of the people that is significant, and I've never really announced this before, one of my favorite graphic novels of all time is Paul Auster. Paul Karasik and David Mazzucchelli.
Mazzucchelli.
Yes, that graphic novel.
City of Glass.
City of Glass has such a tremendous
adaptations, literary adaptations.
Brilliant, brilliant.
Yeah.
So I'm looking to do something that dense. It will be a challenge to do it over a period of time. I will be working in my studio, in my home studio, but I will also, from time to time, be streaming from the gallery space while I'm working in real time. So it is a powerful, powerful opportunity. I hope, and I'll leave that to the historians, to contribute once again to the lexicon of Afrofuturism, but to hopefully also extend it.
Well, you have a history of works that do that around other topics. What can you tell us very quickly as time is running down? What can you tell us about how did the publishing world? If you have a publisher, I'm not going to say who, but how was it accepted? Did it go out to multiple publishers? Can I probe a little bit?
What can I say? What can I say? It did go out to multiple publishers, but what I think we've done is we found the publisher that has because look, I've been independent. I've been a mainstream publishing guy. I've done both, and which I thought at one point was bad was actually very good because I can see the point of view from both vantage points. But I also would say with this particular publisher, they have the right sensitivity.
Yeah.
And they let me work. And that's everything. That's everything. I want to make sure that I can do a project that all of the people who are here in this conversation, I have deep respect for each and every one of you, can hopefully, if I just give blood and flesh, which you guys know I'll do, and don't worry, I got to do the exercise and all that, do better. I want to do something that you will feel proud of.
Well, I know you will. I know you're working hard. Wow, let's see, where are we at now? We're about at an hour. Did I leave anything out? Any closing comments?
Yes.
About this project?
There's the closing comments.
How much have you gotten done so far? How much?
Right
how
now
long are
we're
you?
about between 20 pages in, but that's constantly growing because I'm working on multiple pages at the same time. And also we're putting together all of the other material. Dr. Chambliss has his contribution, and Dr. Anderson, they're both front and back matter effectively of this show.
Mm-hmm.
And like I said, it will be growing every week. We wanted to do something that would build organically.
Love it. You know what? I've had a chance to talk with you about so many of your other works, Tim. You really, push the medium. We're in a great moment for comics as a medium. It's expanded. It's transformed the book world, just as the book format has transformed comics. I can't wait to see this book. It will add to this incredible era of innovation and vision, with comics as a foundation that's just very exciting for me and for others surrounding. Are there any other comments you want to make before we close out?
One of the things when I think of the life of Du Bois, he basically kind of tells you what he thought of the United States by being buried over in Accra, Ghana. And I'm thinking about what he would say, knowing in the last 10 years, the environment in this country, they've dismantled voting rights.
Yeah.
They've recently dismissed affirmative action, and they're steadily peeling away a lot of the things that the victories that they had achieved on the eve of his passing. in the mid 60s. And I'm just curious, one of the things I wonder if he could write a short story now, what would it be like? Because, I think the second best short story after the Comet, maybe Tim will do that, but it's been done already, is I think, what Derek Bell wrote about the space traders? The short story, in terms of what kind of short story would be, could kind of illustrate this moment in the way that the Comet did for its moment. And so that's kind of what's been on my mind now. How would Du Bois, what would he write now if he was still with us?
Yeah, I agree. If there is one recurring thought related to work by Du Bois and work by these earlier generation writers, they face, incredibly dire circumstances, and they use art, speculative work, as a way to sort of think through that. So I think it's incumbent upon us to sort of revisit this work, and I really commend Tim for his adaptation. And comics is a very democratic medium, and to have a graphic novel based on a comic now, I think it's really important. And it's super useful in this sort of time of crisis, and crisis is the word that I think most of us understand that we should use.
Mm-hmm.
So Tim, you get the last word.
It is an absolute joy and pleasure to be alive at this moment. I never thought I would be able to say this. It is a joy, a pleasure, and a privilege, but it's also a responsibility. I see it as a responsibility. It's like what Dr. Anderson was saying. Du Bois is not here, so it's my job to, as best I can, provide visual for him.
Well, look, on that note, thank you, Dr. Reynaldo Anderson. Thank you, Dr. Julian Chambliss. And last but not least, of course, thank you, Tim Fielder. My name's Calvin Reid, and it's been my pleasure and an honor to be a part of this discussion tonight.
Thank you, Calvin. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
And to respond to Calvin, go JSU Tigers.
Hey, man, y'all can't stop. Y'all can't.
That's all right.
Stop.
Who was in the Celebration Bowl this year?
Oh, no, man, really?
How we got there, and believe me, they don't do that too often. So
they
got beat, but we'll take it.
That's terrible.
Hey, I was following the JSU Tigers. I hear you, bro. I hear you, bro.
That's awesome. Awesome.
All right.
So
Hey,
much.
this has been a thrill, an incredible pleasure to get a chance to talk with all of you. I talk to him all the time, but it's great to get a chance to talk to you too. So awesome. I'm going to run out of here now and go get a beer. So
Thank you so much.
you bet. Terrific.